Okay, let me join in from my computer as well. Hey, Mark, how are you?
Hey, JD, I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Living the dream, man. Living the dream.
Cool. Very cool.
All right. So let's share my screen. So let me also open the last version that we had, because that will be sort of handy. Okay. So what we tried to cover last time is the select method, right? Where we say, okay, how can you write your own select? And there, and especially in terms of a generic select, that is, it will work for any T source and T target. So rewinding back, what I discussed was, you can do a projection, right? Select is basically, in computer science, is called projection. That is, you take an I enumerable of T, let's say Tx, and you want to get another I enumerable of, say, Ty, right? So in math, it would be like, basically a function fx applied to, let's say if you have a function fx, right? And if you apply to each element in a enumerable, right, then you would sort of end up with this. Make sense? So then how do we implement that? So that's where it requires you to know a little bit about the syntax of, sorry, bear with me, I'm trying to zoom in just the right amount. Can everyone read this? Yes?
Yep.
Okay. So this is a syntax sort of we went over last time, that, hey, I'll write a method, right? And I'm going to need to take an I enumerable of T source, right? And then I'm going to need a func, which will take a T source and return me a T target, right? And I'm going to return an I enumerable target, right? And because of the syntax for generics, you have to specify all the types that you use inside of angle brackets, right? So it is very important, and I looked at the poll for the generics, only 5 people voted, 3 people wanted to do the generic session deep dive. So we'll sort of skip it. It's just a matter of familiarizing yourself with the syntax, that, hey, you have to define them inside the angle brackets, and then you have to use it somewhere in your definition, right? So we'll take this I enumerable source, right? And then it becomes a very simple problem, especially because we have something called yield return, right? So we will say, hey, go through every item through the source sequence, apply my mapping function to it, and return that value. Make sense so far?
So map is a filter function?
No, map is a mapping function. That's why I called it a map function. I did not call it a filter function. Filter function takes a value and returns me a Boolean so that I can decide whether I want to return that value or not. Right? Here, I'm not going to use this function to decide whether I'm going to return it or not. I'm always going to return everything, because projection is literally one-to-one from input to stream to output stream. It just changes something a little bit when it returns. Make sense?
Okay.
Shashir, Todd, Ashish, Mark, is this clear? the select implementation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then we will sort of come back to the whole single or default or first or default. But let's try to write a first or default first, because that is a little bit easier to write. So I'm not, yeah, we'll just say first or default.
Hey guys, I'm having some Zoom issues, so I'm going to sign out and sign back in.
That's fine. So as I was mentioning, right, first or default takes a stream and gives you the first value in the stream, okay, if the stream has any values, or if the stream is empty, then it is gonna do a default value. Okay, so any thoughts, any ideas as to how we can write that?
Can you repeat the question?
First or default takes a stream and gives me the first value if the stream has any values whatsoever. And if the stream is empty, it will give me the default value.
So first we check for empty and just return the default value.
Let's not use other Linq methods to write Linq method, right? Let's just write a Linq method all on its own.
Okay.
Can
In
you
that
try
case, we
catch? Like try to access the first item. If it doesn't exist, catch will catch the error and then return the default and catch.
you'll still need to find it, Alan, right? So you'll need to go through the list, try to find the item, and eventually, like I think, I guess maintain a Boolean variable, which is false to start off with. As soon as you find the item, it's true. At the end, if it's false, you give the default value back, and if you find the item, then you give the item back.
Correct. Now, this is again, you guys are moving one step forward. I am not taking a filter function here. So I'm not coming to that stage. Let's first write the very, very, very basic first or default, which doesn't even take. Find me a first or default which matches this criteria. Okay, that's different. Okay, it's fine. Let's try to write it. I know how to write it, so we'll go through it, right? So we will just simply say, hey, you know what? I wanna go through the items, right? And let's say I'll see output value. I'll declare a variable, right? And I will say, hey, my output value is equal to item, right? Now here, we'll say, hey, current index equal to 0, right? Here, we'll say current index plus plus, right? And we will say, you know what, stop streaming immediately if I hit the first item. Right? And then I can come here and say, return my output value. Does this make sense? I want to ask the enumerable to say, hey, enumerate over yourself and give me the first value. And I get the first value, I will say, okay, I'm going to stop iterating it and I'm going to return the value.
Don't you need to say if output value equals item, then increment your index?
I think that's what he meant. He doesn't want to do any filtering right now.
Do you not want to initialize output value to something? Is that why it's?
Yes, yes, right? Great, great thought. Thank you. But here, if you see, there is a problem. The problem is compiler is already complaining use of unassigned local variable output value. Because it's no guarantee that items has any values whatsoever. If it's empty, this will run as it is. It will be basically a no-op, and you are left with an uninitialized output value. So this handles the scenario. So far, the code we wrote handles the, so we have two scenarios, right? Scenario 1, return first value of the string, okay? Scenario 2, return default value of t if the string is empty. So we are here handling the scenario 1. Agree? We will say, hey, stream, iterate over yourself, give me the first value, I'll immediately stop iterating. But now we need to worry about this. And that is very simple because in Linq, not Linq, in C#, in generate, you have a special operator called default where you put the t and it will give you the default value for t. So this is a special syntax. Default operator takes t as a parameter and returns the default value for that t. So for example, if you do default int, what will it give? Anyone?
0.
Perfect. Let's say I do default string. What will it give?
Null string.
No. Perfect. Let's say if I do default date time, what will it give?
1970 some date.
Well, it will give you date time dot min value.
1st of January 1970.
Right? So I'm guessing most of you would not have used the default operator because you might not have written a generate method or type. Because if you don't really write that kind of generate methods, then you don't really need to know about it. But now we want to write a generate first or default method. So it sort of makes sense that there is an operator for that. Does this implementation make sense?
JD, what if this type T is a custom class that we're creating?
It doesn't matter,
Yeah.
right? All
Well,
reference
reference
types
type.
are automatically null by
Oh,
default.
okay. Okay, understood.
Yeah,
Right?
but the null doesn't fit the return type of t.
It absolutely does. Why wouldn't it fit the return type of T?
I guess it's the default.
T is
I
T,
guess maybe that
right?
makes sense. Sure.
T is T. If it's value type, you'll get a default value type value. If it's a reference type, you'll get the default type of null, right? So it works. Sorry.
Yeah.
So does everyone agree with this implementation of Linq first or default? That it makes sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
So how can we sort of make it better? I don't know if they enhanced it, but I never liked that, you know, it gives me the default T, right? Why? I don't want to get the default of T. I'm going to pass that, right? So I can say, give me T default value. Right? I will let my caller control what is the default value. And that's more interesting. Right? So let's give it a go. Now it is asking for the default value, so we need to make that optional. I don't know if this will be allowed, but let's give it a go. Look at that, it works. I hadn't tried that, but it works. So I'm saying by default, I'm gonna take the default of the T, but if you wanna pass a custom default, I will take that. So that's pretty sweet. I'll do this. And I get the 1 because, well, my numbers have values, but let's get rid of it and try it again. I get 0, which is the default value for integer. But, you know, for my use case, I might be like, hey, you know what, give me max value of integer because I want to do something interesting. And I can validate my logic better versus getting a 0. So I can do that, and I get integer 32.max value if the stream is empty. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a little bit. I want to look at you guys and see, like, did it make sense, the Linq first or default? Right, pretty simple, 5-6 lines of code, no rocket science.
What was wrong with my answer? Do a try catch, and if you access the first item in the list, if it's an error, then you return default. I mean, I guess it wouldn't work if it was like a class you're passing in, right? But in this simple case of a list of integers.
So that's more of a philosophical question. Try catch is supposed to be, you don't want to write your logic in terms of try catch. And I just had that discussion with Sashir recently, right? It is not a good idea to express your normal business logic in terms of the try catch. Try catch is meant to do structured exception handling, not implement your business logic. Now that's a very nuanced topic, and when we go through the exception handling thing, which is what I want to cover next time, we will go through that detail as to why you don't want to try catch. And it's a general tendency a lot of time people have, but it's not ideal, right? Because unless, I mean, you tell me, right? Let's look at the code again. Think about what you were proposing versus what this code is. Which one do you think is easier to follow? So there are aspects around that. So that is why, you know, we do it this way. C# guys themselves have done something similar. Again, I highly encourage you guys to look at what they have done. They don't exactly write this, it's just slightly tweaked, but the conceptually is the same thing. Okay, so now let's say I wanted to say, enhance this guy and say, for a given I enumerable T, take a filter function and then give me first or default. Right now our first or default is very naive. It just says first. You can't say, give me the first which matches this criteria, right? And that is more interesting. So can anyone tell me how we will modify this definition? We'll first talk about the signature, and then we will talk about the implementation.
Then
Anyone?
pass in a func of which returns a bool.
What would, that's a good answer, but what would that func look like? Tell me. Func.
A func t source bool.
Where is source? I don't see any T source.
Sorry, t comma bool.
Perfect.
And then in for each, you just use the filter.
Perfect. Right? So this makes sense. I am now going to take the filter function, right? So now I'm going to say if filter item right, it has to first match my criteria, right? It has to match my criteria, then only I will assign it to output value, then only I will increase the index, right? And then I'll go here. And now this index sort of seems misleading to me. I don't like that, right? So I'm going to say if found first value, I'm going to say false, right? I'm going to here come back here and say if not found, no, if found first value, then I'm going to break the whole chain. Otherwise, I assign it. Much better.
Instead of doing, do we even need the found first value? Can't we just return as soon as we get the first item? If
But then
filter just
you have to account for the default value, right? That's why.
no, I'm saying in line number 170. Can we just return it? If filter return.
Actually, you are absolutely right. I forgot about that. We don't have to do anything. We don't even have to keep track of this. You are right, my sir. We can just say, hey, just return. You are correct. As soon as it matches, we return and we break the iteration automatically. If no iteration happens, then we get the default value the user passed and we return that. Much simpler. Does this make sense to everyone, how first or default is implemented? With the filter and with an ability to pass default value if you wanted to. So now, let's give this one a go. We'll say, 1 second, I need to. Let's put our numbers back. Now we can say, we can specify criteria. And we will use lambda expression to do that. We'll say, well, x, let me find my first even value. right? And now I run it. That didn't do the right thing.
Yeah, because I think in both cases it looked like you were returning output value, which is the default, as opposed to item should return item.
Uh, well done, Alan. Well done. Thank you. You have to return item and not output output value. In fact, I don't need to even declare this because this is not doing anything. So I can simplify this further here. Right, now let's run this and we get 2. Very sharp eye, Alan, very sharp eye. So this is it. This is how first order default works. Literally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines of code. And now let me give you one interesting exercise. What if I wanted to implement this first order default by just using this guy? You know, you would have overloaded methods based on the parameter. The lowest level method will take n number of parameters, and you try to default some values for simpler use cases. Can someone tell me how can I implement this by calling this? Mark?
What I would do is, I mean, and this is assuming that you're omitting, I mean, what about the filter? I guess what I don't understand is why you wouldn't want this in this other function up here.
So the thing is that, okay, let's break it down, right? When we wrote the first one, we said we don't really care about filter criteria. I want the first or default value from the stream. Right? Makes sense?
Okay.
And then I wrote another function, first or default, where I take the stream and I also take a filter criteria, and then I return first or default on that. Right? But now, this is just a more specific use case of the second guy.
So you could just basically call the method and then pass in an anonymous expression for the filter function.
Correct. What will that filter expression look like is my question.
I guess X such that X.
Sorry?
Would it be X such that it returns the same thing X?
Yeah, return X. So this is where you know you need to start visualizing generics more, and it will make sense. So I'll write it and then we'll see. Okay, so we'll say, hey, I want to call my this guy, the one below, right? I'm going to pass in my default value as it is. That is the second parameter. I'll pass in whatever I'm getting. Now I have to return this guy, right? And you're saying essentially there is no filter criteria, right? So you can just say, hey, return true. Every element satisfies the criteria when I don't want to filter them. I don't know. I hope that was sort of interesting and a little bit of aha moment. Because when you say, hey, every element is valid for a criteria, then I get that behavior that I'm looking for. So I can take the input, I can just ignore it, and I can just say, yes, this element is valid for my filter. Make sense?
Yep.
Mark, Ritesh, did that make sense?
It definitely
Yeah.
makes sense. I think the returning true is very clever.
The thing is, at the end, it's not even clever. You know you have to return true or false, right? It's just that your notion is always like, hey, I need to take something and use it to produce a true or false, but that's not necessarily required, right?
Right.
The func, what does func say? Func says T bull. It says, I will give you a T and you give me a bull.
Right.
Nor does it say that you have to use the T to produce the bull.
Right. No, I mean, that is completely valid. I see that as soon as you guys mentioned it, it instantly clicked. But, you know, I never had to do that before. So it's, yeah, it jumped out at me when you said it. But before that, it was very, I wouldn't have guessed it. Let me put it that way.
Right. And it's fine. You know, you are not a library writer, right? You write line of business application. Your needs are different. You will never actually write a filter like this because that doesn't do anything for the business problem you're trying to solve. And that is where looking at the base class libraries code is a tremendous gift to learn better techniques, to learn more techniques. How can you solve problems in a layered fashion that you can sort of compose together and solve more interesting problems? Okay. So first or default has this kind of overloads. They will have a one base, one implementation, then the one where you know, you don't have to specify filter, and it makes sense that you do this. Yeah. Should we go to the next one?
Think it's
Or default? Everyone is clear on first or default?
Yes.
So I will actually upload this one. One thing I was chatting with Alan one-on-one yesterday because he needs he needed a little bit help. One thing I would suggest in addition to exercises is take the script that we have and try to write these things from scratch without looking at it. Right, so watch that. Let's say we spend 38 minutes on first or default, you understand it. Now, let's say after the session, create a new script and try to write first or default on your own without looking at anything. Can you remember the syntax? Can you remember the nuances? And then try to write a sample code which will test your first or default method. And when you do that, then you will really start to get full hang of, hey, how do I implement these things? Okay? All right. So now, let's come to my favorite one, single or default. Okay? And this one, let's start from the first step itself. We will take the filter as well, because I think people now feel comfortable with taking additional filter as well, right? So we will write a single or default like this, right? Where the signature is the same. It's just that it's going to do single or default and not first or default. So any ideas on how can we do this? Let's see. Mark, you want to take a crack?
I would iterate through the collection and basically count the number of items that return true. Or that's one way of doing it.
Yep, that is the way to do it. And do you want to count everyone, or do you want to just count more than one?
Just more than one. So actually, as you hit the second true statement, you can return an exception.
Perfect. So we'll say number of items found equal to 0. So far, we don't have anything, right? Now we will start iterating over items. Then we will say if filter item, then we'll say number of items found equal to number of items found plus 1, right? Now here we'll also say output value equal to my default value, right? Just in case I don't go through anything. And then I'll say output value equal to the current item. Right? And then we will also say, hey, if number of items found equal to 2, somewhere in the loop, it runs into that, we'll say throw new invalid operation exception, found more than one element matching the criteria. Right? Because we want to stop the iteration through the exception. And here, we will just return the output value. Right? So if the stream is empty, all this is no op. Right? It's basically, if the stream is empty, our code is like this. Return the default value. If stream is not empty, we went through the item, applied the filter, increased the counter, set the last value, and if we found more than one, we know code will throw an exception. And we bail out of it. But if it's only one item in the list, then code will end up here. And we set that value with the filter, so it should work.
Hey, JD?
Yeah?
Why not make the if number of items found equal to a child of if filter item? Like, it's the same thing. I'm just curious why not nest it within the if filter?
This is just a personal preference, right? And we should talk about it sometime.
Because there you're evaluating that extra time set, right? Because you're going to evaluate that time. You're going to evaluate that check when you know you haven't incremented it.
Agreed. This is perfectly valid. Yes, 100% valid. Nothing wrong with that. Okay. I generally tend to avoid nested ifs. Right? There is an expression called cyclometric complexity, where it's basically the more decision points you have like nested, it increases the cyclometric complexity. Is a name. I don't know why that name is there, but it makes code harder to read. So it's a pure personal preference, but this is completely valid as well. And by putting it outside, technically you are evaluating it more than necessary, but
yeah, like, I hear your voice from like previous lessons where it's like, this is so cheap. This is not even taking like a fraction of a millisecond. Like, I get that it's like, it's not taking a lot of time, but it would still, and I get it. Like, there's a trade-off. I don't like lots of nesting either, but I also, it would bother me that I'm evaluating something in cases where it doesn't need to be evaluated.
Right. So, that is where, software is overall a little bit of an art, right? There is only not one way to do it. And you try to find the balance for your own self, what makes it readable for you, right? For me, readability, once the program is working, readability trumps everything. So I would naturally just write what I wrote, is what I'm saying. That's what I have learned after spending X many years writing code. But it's completely fine if you think this is more appealing to you. Right? But do we agree that the single or default implementation looks fairly reasonable?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now let's test it out. You can do output again, numbers dot link single or default. We'll say x equal to 7, right? It should dump the value. Then we say, hey, let's try to find more than 2. And it says found more than one element matching the criteria. To match the link one, it will say sequence contains more than one matching element or something like that, right? They will throw that exception. And I wish Uma was here because I thought about this and prepared this example specifically for her. Like, people don't use single or default because when you get this error, you have no idea what is going on. Right? Let's say you're writing a program which is multiple lines of code and somewhere you have some complicated logic and you have something here, and then not single or default, but let's say for single especially, right? You're like, I want a single value, but if I put it, I get a funky exception, then I'm in, like, doesn't make sense. So I'll rather just do single, or I'll rather just switch to first or default, because then I'm like, my code keeps working, right? But that's not the way to go, right? You don't want your code to keep working under unknown circumstances, because then everything after that point, you have no idea what's going on. You cannot reason about the code anymore. Just yesterday, Sishir and I were chatting. He was trying to write this Symfony bot, and it got some funny errors. And Sishir's like, what is going on? Like, I cannot wrap my head around it. Right? I helped him out. We solved the problem. And this is what I see time and time again. When you as a developer don't think about what are the input conditions which must be true for you to continue and don't validate that, the code will continue, go through some path and end up in a universe that you can't recognize. You don't want to go there, right? So you can actually write a better single or default. A better single or default, which will take an error message for you. Because that's all you want, actually. So now I can say final error message equal to, if it's empty, then I'm gonna throw my default. Otherwise, I'm gonna let the user pick my error message, and I'll throw that. Right? Now, I can come here and say, in numbers, expecting one even number, found more than one. We'll get the default value as this, and error message is this. Because this is exactly what you wanted to be able to put in there. And then you'll be very comfortable with using single. And feel free to add as much context as you want. Capture the name of the variable, capture some business logic and say, hey, I was expecting one, I found more than one, la, 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 right? And now I run it. And now program still barfs, but it barfs in a way that if you get that error message, you immediately know what went wrong. Because it's saying sequence contains more than one matching element is not useful for a complex program. but you being able to put your business logic error message here changes the game completely. So I'm gonna take a little pause here. First or default, single or default, and how you actually solve the problem in a way that your program will do the right thing. I still want to know if there are voters for first or default.
How often do you use this though? I'm trying to think in my world, like if I would ever do that, and I just can't come up with any situations where I've needed.
I need it all the time. I wrote my single or default long time ago as soon as I ran into it. I wrote my overloaded single method that lets me specify a meaningful error message. Right? And then you will use single, right? And then there is no reason to use first or default. So I hope, Todd, that helps a little bit more compared to what I was saying last time, where you couldn't see the path forward. Because I heard you guys' complaints as well, right? The error that Linq gives is not at all useful, and you want something useful. But you can do that on your own. Yeah? Okay. This is good. I think it's...
Oh, I was going to say one of the things I was thinking about as I was doing some of the exercises was that when you use first or default, you're really banking on the implementation to return the result set in an ordinal fashion. And you don't know if the underlying data structure is ordered.
That's another great point. That is why I was saying last time, I don't see that many use cases for first or default in my like 10, 15, 18 years of programming for writing line of business applications for finance. It's very rare I'll come across that. I mostly want single or default because ordering matters.
Yeah, I can see that too, and it's a level of abstraction as far as knowing the business logic and needing to worry about its implementation. So I agree.
Cool. All right, so we have 7 minutes left. We can continue for 10, 15 minutes going through what I want to go through, or we can just chat about, hey, some thoughts, question which arises after this session. Your preference. I'm fine with either.
More stuff.
Does no one have any question? I feel like Ritesh has a question he's holding back.
So I tried this function thing wherein it takes a source and a t result at the end. So I tried whatever I knew about, but I was not able to figure out the question that you asked last week as to why t result is at the end. I mean, I thought to keep it at first, but I was not able to find any error in that logic.
Right. Oh, so great. Let's talk about that. Thanks for bringing it up. I think Ashish also asked me a question in the beginning. What was that question that we?
High disposable.
High disposable.
High disposable. Yes. Do you guys want to go over those two questions?
I have one more question as well.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the func and the t result at the end. Did everyone get what Ritesh is asking, or I should repeat the question first so that it makes sense what I'm trying to answer? Let's go through that. So func definition is, so func definition is always like this: T1, T result. You get the gist, right? This is the input, this is the result. This is the input 1, input 2, this is the result. Input 1, 2, 3, and the result, right? And what I asked as a hypothetical question is, why do we say t result is always at the end? Why not at the beginning? Or actually, so that was my question, but I hope everyone agrees that it wouldn't make sense for it to be like this, right? You wouldn't want to define it like this. Yes, Ritesh?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So we all agree that, you know what, we need to put the t result somewhere. And, you know, from a delegate definition, the order doesn't really matter, right? But you want to have some structure around it. So you put the order, you say, hey, let me put all the inputs first and t result at the end. So the way I see it, they had two choices basically. Either they do it this way, or they do it this way. Do we all agree that the generic delegates func could be defined in these two fashions? That makes logical sense. We don't want to do anything else, right? Yes, Ritesh?
Yep.
So if that's the case, then why did they choose this over this? So that is to help you with type inference. Now, let me see if I can think of an example. It'll be a little tricky, but let's say you had a function which returns a string, okay? And there are multiple overloads for that, okay? So you call the method with, say, let's define the input like this: var integer integer I equal to 10, string input equal to hello, right? And imagine if there is a method which takes integer and string and returns a string, and you had this t result first. In terms of mapping, how would you specify that ordering? I'm not able to think of a good example. I will try to come up with a good example to answer the question. One thing I want to note though is that if you have a generic method like this one, I actually can specify I enumerable of int. Let me specify it here, right? I can say no. I can specify a type parameter for my method. That is, if you look at this, right here, actually I say there is a t, right? Why don't I specify it upstairs when I call it? Right? Well, compiler guy says, you know what? Remember I told you about type inference where it figures out things. So it figured out, oh, this is something that could turn into a func integer bool, and I'm calling on numbers. So you must be calling this method with integer as a type parameter. That's the only way it makes sense. So it infers that, so you don't have to specify that. But sometimes you could run into a situation where compiler won't be able to infer the type because there are overloads which are confusing to compiler. It will find more than one. Then you will have to say, hey, call the integer and the string combo of the method, or don't call integer one, call the double one, and things like that, right? And Ritesh, try to think about it. When you do it this way, at the end, there is a better chance of success with the type inference versus when you do it this way. I don't know if that made sense, but I hope you dig into a little bit and you will see what I'm trying to say.
Yep.
Yeah?
Yep.
Did it click already? I don't have to find the example.
No, so I guess I got the it's a thread at which I could start thinking, but yes, I'll find an answer.
Well, please do come up with a good example
Yes.
and let's share it with the group. Because I'm not able to think of a good example which will really bring that aha moment. But I hope I give you the little tube light that you can try to turn it on and find the answer. So yes, this is where one thing I sort of find is a lot of time compiler does a lot of things for you, and knowing them in a little bit more detail will help you remove some confusion. Okay, and then Ashish's question, I enumerable, why is it marked as I disposable? We will take it the next time, Ashish, because when we talk about lazy execution, right, that is what I actually wanted to talk about today, it will probably make more sense. And I don't know if everyone wrote their I enumerable implementation or not. If you write your own I enumerable, then it will actually make sense why it needs to be I disposable. So that's the exercise number
2 or 3.
2, I think.
2, yeah.
So on the exercise that I gave, if you do exercise chapter 1, exercise 2, if you implement that and show me that class, then I can explain you why it makes sense to have an I disposable. Otherwise, it won't really make that much sense unless you write a raw I enumerable on your own.
I have 2 thoughts. So one, going back to the previous question from Ritesh, do you think that T result is the last parameter because that is most in line with conventions, and when the implementation of the function delegate was being written, maybe it uses out parameters to define that? And then the second question I have is, when I was implementing my IEnumerable class, I had, for the generic type, the generic delegate, I had to override or implement the get enumerator for both generic and non-generic types. And I thought that was a little strange.
So you don't have to implement the non-generic IEnumerable T, right? You just have to, don't implement the non-generic IEnumerable. And again, regarding the T result being last, I'm gonna put it on Ritesh to find us a good example where it will make sense. Because I really can't think of an example off the top of my head. So I don't wanna try to make stuff up.
Okay. Okay, right. Yeah. So I'll send you my class at some point. We can discuss maybe what I'm doing, because I was getting a warning.
Yeah,
if I didn't implement that. Sure.
Yep.
Sure, we'll do.
Send me links and we'll go from there. Yes, Ashir, you had a question?
Yeah. So first of default generally was I mean, I know through my code reviews with you, but for everyone else, like it's like one of those few things that you don't like in C#, I believe. Otherwise, generally you praise the entire design and what they think of and what they put out pretty nicely. So my 2 questions: one, in which cases would you, who doesn't like it, use it? And 2, are there other things? So for example, this is something now that I will keep an eye out, right? Like, let's not use first of default when I can use single, which makes more sense. Are there, and this is not a question for now, maybe if you want to think about it and come back, are there other things like this which are out of the box functions which C# gives us, which we shouldn't be using, and we should be using alternates, which you've seen in your experience people use a lot?
Okay, so
or is this
second
one of
part,
those black sheep? Yeah.
yeah, so let me clarify. I'm not saying that I don't like first or default. I don't think I'm trying to say that at all. What I'm trying to say is I don't see many use cases for it, and people use it without understanding that subtle distinction between the two. And as I was telling Todd earlier, when you do that, your code behavior is unknown. So I don't like that. I want to be very mindful for every single method call, every single character that I write. Right? And then when you use it, let's say, for example, single or default, I didn't like that either because it threw an exception that is not helping me troubleshoot the problem easily. Then I'll write my own. Right? So that is my goal. And when we talk about, whenever this Linq series finishes and we actually go into exception handling and system design, then I'll talk about you don't have to be constrained by what is offered in the library. As you can now see, single or default is 5 lines of code. You can write your own that serves your need better. And my biggest pet peeve is that people don't think about those. They think, oh, this is available, that's all I have. But that is not true. You are a developer, you can write another layer on top. And the beauty is, it's designed for you to write a layer on top. So the way I see it is what most of the people end up doing is they think they're familiar with .NET at some level. They know some NuGet package, and then they just use that. And as you're working on my thing, you know, I have my own layer for everything on top to help me build a system the way I want a system to be built, the way I want to do error reporting. And that is what most of the people miss or don't think about. So no, and I don't think there is anything wrong by Linq guys doing it because they are serving everyone in the world. So they have to have a first or default. They have to have a single or default, right? Mm-hmm. So it's completely fair to include it because there are use cases for that, right? We don't have those kind of use cases in the line of work that we do.
Okay.
Okay. Cool. Todd, any final comments before we call it off the Sunday?
No, no comments. That was great. All
right, perfect. All right, guys, every day we just cover one item of my 4-point agenda to somehow speed this up, but it's okay, no big deal. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you guys next Sunday. Okay.
Cool, man. Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a good weekend, guys.